Every single person in the room rose simultaneously, as if pulled by an invisible string. Just moments before, the very same people had been stifling their laughter at my expense. I stood awkwardly in the grand doorway of the Whitmore family dining room, feeling every inch of my disheveled appearance. My combat boots, usually meticulously cleaned, were caked with the dust of a rural roadside. My Marine Corps jacket, a symbol of my pride and service, was smudged with an unsightly streak of grease across the sleeve. My hair, typically pulled back in a taut, disciplined bun, had long since escaped its confines, now a messy, rebellious knot. I vividly recalled Margaret Whitmore leaning conspiratorially toward one of her guests, whispering something that triggered a wave of polite yet undeniably mocking chuckles. A familiar heat rushed to my face, a burning flush of humiliation. It was then, just as my cheeks grew hot, that the distinct rumble of an old pickup truck engine slowly made its way up the gravel driveway outside. A beat later, the front door of the mansion creaked open, echoing through the elegant hall. And then, without warning, every individual seated at that polished dinner table, including Harold Whitmore himself, the man who had spent the last 20 minutes making it excruciatingly clear I was an unwelcome intrusion in his family's perfect world, suddenly stood to their feet. I hadn't a clue what was unfolding, what cosmic shift had just occurred. But one thing resonated with absolute certainty: the atmosphere had fractured, irrevocably changed. And this dramatic turning point had its unassuming genesis earlier that afternoon, some 30 miles down the winding expanse of Route 17. My name is Emily Carter, and I am a staff sergeant in the United States Marine Corps. At the precise juncture of this story, I had recently returned from a rigorous 7-month deployment overseas, a world away from the quiet rhythms of home. I was stationed at Marine Corps Base Quantico in Virginia, which meant I had slowly, almost reluctantly, reacclimated to the serene pulse of Northern Virginia life. It was a world of ancient tree-lined roads that whispered history of cozy, small-town diners, where the coffee was always hot, of sprawling old farms that dotted the landscape like forgotten paintings, and of friendly neighborhoods where the simple act of waving to a passing car was still a common, cherished gesture. Coming home after a deployment always felt like stepping into a slightly distorted reality. You spent months immersed in a realm where every minute was meticulously structured, every action imbued with critical purpose, where life and death decisions often hung in the balance. Then abruptly, you were plunged back into the mundane ebb and flow of ordinary existence, where people fretted over trivialities like rush hour traffic, the price of groceries, or the perfect shade of green for their lawn. But during that particular week, my mind was consumed by a much more significant, daunting challenge. I was finally, after nearly 2 years, going to meet Daniel Whitmore's parents. Daniel and I had been a constant in each other's lives for almost 2 years, a whirlwind romance that began through a mutual friend at a lively 4th of July barbecue in Fredericksburg. He was everything I wasn't: a civil engineer, grounded in the tangible world of blueprints and construction firms, tall with an easy grace, thoughtful to a fault, and possessed of a rare, deep-seated patience that often felt like a balm to my more intense nature. Yet his family, well, that was an entirely different narrative, a complex tapestry woven with threads of tradition, expectation, and unspoken class distinctions. The Whitmores were that family in town, the kind whispered about in hushed tones, over brunch and discussed with an air of mild reverence. Their name was synonymous with old Virginia money, generations of inherited wealth and influence. Their sprawling colonial house, nestled elegantly outside Warrington, was less a home and more an estate, complete with horse property, active memberships on various prestigious charity boards, and naturally exclusive golf club affiliations. Daniel had always been transparent, almost brutally honest about them. Their traditional hut, he'd told me once, a diplomatic understatement that thinly veiled their unspoken disapproval of a Marine dating their esteemed son. His mother, Margaret, had once probed, only half-joking, during a strained phone call Daniel had recounted. "Don't you think you'd be happier, Daniel, with someone a little more refined?" His father, Harold, had been even more blunt, his words cutting through the phone line like a sharp blade. A woman in the Marine Corps, Harold Whitmore, had scoffed during a call Daniel had foolishly put on speaker, his voice dripping with barely concealed disdain. "Son, that's not exactly the life I pictured for my future daughter-in-law. We have expectations." Daniel, to his credit, had defended me fiercely every single time. But I could sense the emotional toll it took on him, the subtle way the situation weighed heavily on his shoulders. So when he called me one evening, a mere week after my return from deployment, I knew with a certainty that tightened my stomach that something significant was about to happen. Emily, he began, his voice a careful blend of anticipation and apprehension. My parents are hosting a dinner this Saturday and they want you to come. I leaned back against the worn cushions of my small Quantico apartment couch, the worn fabric a stark contrast to the elegance I knew awaited me. That sounds formal, I stated, a slight tremor in my voice. It is, he admitted, a sigh escaping his lips. But they genuinely want to meet you. I paused, chewing on the implication. Or, I offered, a cynical edge creeping into my tone. They want to inspect me. Daniel let out a soft, rueful chuckle. Maybe a little of both, he conceded. Then his voice deepened, becoming more earnest. Look, I know they've said some things that weren't fair, Emily. I know they've been difficult. But if they actually meet you, truly meet you, they'll see what I see. I promise. That single sentence, "they'll see what I see," echoed in the quiet space of my apartment, clinging to my thoughts. I desperately wanted it to be true. I wanted them to see past the uniform, past their preconceived notions, to the woman Daniel loved. Saturday afternoon arrived, cloaked in the crisp golden hues of a perfect Virginia fall. I left base early, the familiar camouflage uniform, traded for a simple, understated navy dress and low, sensible heels. I packed a small overnight bag, just in case, though I wasn't entirely sure what that case might entail, and began the hour-long drive toward Warrington. The October weather was a gift, cool, invigorating air, golden leaves pirouetting across the road like tiny dancers, and long, peaceful stretches of farmland, glowing with an almost ethereal light in the late afternoon sun. I remember a fleeting thought, a quiet hope blossoming in my chest. This feels like a good day for new beginnings. The drive to the Whitmore estate was estimated at about an hour. Plenty of time, I thought, to mentally prepare for the impending inquisition. Or so I believed. About halfway there, nestled just outside a blink-and-you-miss-it rural intersection, my gaze fell upon an old pickup truck incongruously pulled over onto the grassy shoulder. Its hood gaped open, a sign of distress. An elderly man stood beside it, his lean frame hunched over the engine bay, a look of stubborn, almost desperate determination etched onto his weathered face. Most cars, true to the impersonal nature of modern travel, whizzed right past him. For a moment, a brief, fleeting moment, I found myself doing the same. Then, without conscious thought, my ingrained marine instincts kicked in, overriding any anxiety about being late. You don't leave someone stranded if you can help it. It wasn't a choice. It was a reflex, a fundamental tenet of my training and my being. I slowed the car, carefully pulled onto the gravel shoulder, and stepped out. The man looked up, startled, his eyes widening slightly. "Afternoon, ma'am," he greeted, wiping hands grimy with engine oil on a stained rag. "You having trouble?" I asked, my voice calm and steady, an echo of countless situations where I'd had to assess and assist. He offered a small, sheepish smile, a flash of vulnerability. "Truck overheated. Thought I could get her going again, but..." He shrugged, a gesture of defeat. The pickup truck was ancient, a late 70s model perhaps. It possessed a rugged, solid frame, a testament to an era of uncompromising build, but it was also unmistakably well used, worn with the dignity of hard labor. I glanced at the dashboard thermometer, confirming the obvious. The engine block was radiating a dangerous heat. "Mind if I take a look?" I offered, already moving closer. He studied me for a beat, his gaze lingering on the faded emblem of my Marine Corps jacket. Then a slow nod. "Well now," he said, a hint of a smile touching his lips, "I won't turn down help from a Marine." And that, unbeknownst to me then, was the pivotal moment. Had I simply kept driving that afternoon, none of the ensuing extraordinary events would have transpired. What I failed to grasp in that instant was that helping this man would make me very late. Late enough to stride into the Whitmore dinner, looking like I had quite literally crawled out from under a truck. Late enough for them to not merely observe, but to openly laugh at me. And most significantly, late enough for something else entirely, something utterly unexpected to occur. Something none of us in our wildest imaginings could have foreseen. The old pickup, a faded forest green Ford, seemed to carry the weight of Virginia's countless country miles. It was the kind of truck you rarely encountered anymore, relegated to the nostalgic landscapes of old farms or the dusty back roads of small towns, where people stubbornly nurtured their machinery long after most folks would have deemed them fit only for the junkyard. The paint had chipped in a mosaic of places, revealing patches of rust. The once gleaming chrome bumper bore a noticeable dent on one side, and the hood itself trembled slightly, a living entity, as waves of oppressive heat billowed out from the engine compartment. The elderly man stepped back, wiping his hands again, with the same tattered rag, now even blacker with grease. "Name's Frank," he said, extending a hand that was surprisingly strong despite its age. "Aye, bonsoir." "Emily," I replied, my grip firm as I shook his. His eyes crinkled as he nodded toward my jacket. "Marine Corps." It wasn't a question, but a statement of recognition. "Yes, sir." He smiled, a quiet, knowing smile that was instantly approving. "Well, I'll be damned. Haven't seen that Eagle Globe and anchor up close in a while." There was something in the way he uttered those words, a resonance that made me pause, a flicker of understanding passing between us. "You serve?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. He chuckled softly, a sound like dry leaves rustling. "Long time ago. Vietnam." That explained the particular depth in his eyes, a somber understanding that only combat veterans truly shared. I had witnessed it before countless times in the quiet camaraderie of older veterans at the VFW hall outside Quantico. It was a certain calm weight, a profound stillness that people carried after having walked through the crucible of war, a knowledge that transcended words. I stepped closer to the engine, leaning over to get a better look. The problem, once I assessed it, was not complex. The radiator hose had simply loosened imperceptibly at first, allowing coolant to seep out, until the engine, starved of its vital fluid, had overheated dramatically while Frank was driving. "You are close to cooking this engine, Frank." I stated the gravity of the situation, clear in my tone. Frank sighed, a sound heavy with resignation. "Yeah, she's been threatening to give up on me for years now." "Let's see if we can buy her a few more," I said, a challenge in my voice. I walked back to my car, retrieved the small, well-worn tool pouch I always kept in the trunk. Marines I knew learned to improvise and fix things in the field, whether it was a piece of specialized equipment, a cranky generator, or whatever mechanical failure struck. When you were miles, sometimes continents, from proper logistical support. Frank watched silently as I expertly tightened the errant hose clamp and refilled the radiator with what little coolant remained in his emergency supply. "You ever work on engines?" he asked, his voice laced with a newfound respect. "Enough to get myself out of trouble," I replied, a small smile playing on my lips. He laughed, a genuine hearty sound. "Well, I'm glad someone knows what they're doing," while the engine slowly cooled, emitting soft hisses of steam. We leaned against the sturdy frame of the truck, the shared experience forging an easy, unexpected bond. Frank told me he resided some 15 miles down the road in a small farmhouse that had been lovingly passed down through his family since the 1950s. "Just me now," he added, his voice softening, a poignant note of loneliness. "Wife passed 6 years ago." I nodded gently, my heart aching with empathy. "I'm sorry to hear that, Frank." He looked down at this gravel road for a moment, a private memory crossing his features, then offered a small, bittersweet smile. "Good woman schoolteacher, kept me in line for 42 years." The image of such a life, so different from my own transient existence, made me smile in return. "What about you?" he asked, turning the conversation back to me. "Got family around here?" "Not really," I admitted. "I'm stationed at Quantico, so this is home for now." "And what brings a Marine out to these country roads today?" He probed gently, his curiosity piqued. I hesitated, a flicker of anxiety returning. "Actually, I confessed I'm on my way to meet my boyfriend's parents." Frank raised an eyebrow, a knowing glint in his eye. "Well, now that sounds serious." I gave a nervous, self-conscious laugh. "It is. First meeting, yes, sir." "Let me guess," he said, folding his arms across his chest, a shrewd assessment in his gaze. "You're more nervous about that dinner than anything you faced overseas, aren't you?" I laughed again, a fuller, more genuine sound this time, because he wasn't wrong, not even a little bit. "Something like that," I admitted. He studied me carefully, his gaze surprisingly perceptive. "They don't approve, do they? They have their doubts about you." Frank nodded slowly, a profound understanding in his eyes. "I've met that kind before," he murmured. I didn't need to say anything further. He seemed to grasp the unspoken nuances of my situation. People sometimes forget what real character looks like. He observed his voice carrying the weight of years of observation. After a few more minutes, the engine had cooled sufficiently for a test run. I started the truck, the old Ford sputtering to life while Frank watched the hose connection intently. No leak. The engine settled into a steady, reassuring rumble. Frank let out a long breath, a visible wave of relief washing over him. Well, I'll be. I shut the hood, securing it with a decisive click, and stepped back. That should get you home, Frank, I said, a sense of accomplishment warming me. Frank stuck out his hand again. I shook it. His grip still remarkably firm despite his age. Emily, he said, his voice sincere. I truly appreciate you stopping. Most folks wouldn't bother. Anyone would have done the same, I countered almost automatically. He shook his head, a wry smile on his face. Not these days, Marine. Not these days. I glanced at my watch, and my stomach plummeted. I was already 20 minutes behind schedule, a terrible start to an already nerve-wracking evening. Shoot, I muttered under my breath. Frank, ever observant, noticed my distress. Dinner running without you, probably, he offered, a sympathetic look on his face. Well, then we better not keep them waiting. He gave me a knowing smile. I returned his smile, retrieved my tool pouch, and climbed back into my car. As I buckled up, Frank leaned through the open window, his gaze direct and steady. Emily. Yes, sir. He pointed down the road, his eyes twinkling. Those people you're going to meet, they're about to see what kind of woman their son picked. I smiled politely, a flicker of defiant hope igniting within me. I hope so, Frank. I really do. Then I started the engine and pulled back onto the road, the hum of the engine, a stark contrast to the quiet confidence Frank's words had instilled. The sun had sunk lower now, painting the fields in long, stretching shadows of orange and gold. I drove faster than I probably should have, glancing at the clock every few minutes, the numbers ticking away like an accelerating countdown. 30 minutes late, then 35. By the time I finally turned onto the long, winding gravel drive leading to the Whitmore estate, the sickening certainty settled in. I had already made a terrible, irredeemable first impression. The house loomed before me exactly as Daniel had described it. Imposing white columns supporting a wide, elegant front porch, warm, inviting lights glowing from behind tall, paned windows. Several expensive cars, polished to a mirror sheen, were already parked impeccably in the circular driveway, their silent presence a testament to the guests who had arrived punctually. It looked less like a casual family dinner and more like a formal, orchestrated gathering, a social event where every detail was meticulously curated. I stepped out of my car, the gravel crunching under my boots, and it was then, in the stark illumination of the estate lights, that the full extent of my predicament hit me. My hands, they were still visibly stained with dark grease, the grime stubbornly clinging to my skin, and the front of my Marine Corps jacket not much better. I fumbled in my glove compartment for a napkin, frantically trying to wipe away the evidence, but it barely made a dent. Too late now, I thought, a wave of resignation washing over me. I took a deep, fortifying breath, straightened my shoulders, and walked toward the imposing front door, my boots echoing softly on the stone path. The moment I stepped inside, the murmur of polite voices from the dining room greeted me. Laughter, the delicate clinking of silverware, the steady hum of conversation already well underway. Daniel, his face etched with worry, appeared from the hallway the instant he saw me. His eyes widened, first with relief, then with concern. Emily, I was getting worried, he said, his voice hushed. Then his gaze dropped, noticing the grease. What happened? I offered a small, weary shrug. Long story. He smiled softly, a genuine warmth in his eyes that momentarily calmed my nerves. Honestly, I'm just glad you're here. Before I could respond, another voice, clear and commanding, drifted from the dining room. Daniel, a woman called, her tone edged with polite impatience. Is that your guest? Daniel squeezed my hand. A silent gesture of reassurance and warning. Ready, he whispered. I nodded, steeling myself, and together we stepped into the brightly lit dining room. Every conversation at the table ceased abruptly. 10 pairs of eyes, like a firing squad, turned simultaneously toward me. I saw the exact moment Margaret Whitmore, seated imperiously at the head of the table, noticed the telltale grease smudge on my jacket. Her lips painted a perfect rose, curled into a thin, almost imperceptible smile. And that was when the quiet, insidious laughter began. It wasn't loud, not at first. It started as a few hushed chuckles from the far end of the table, the kind people attempted to conceal behind a delicately raised napkin or the rim of a wineglass. But in the sudden cavernous silence of that elegant dining room, even the smallest snicker carried an amplified weight. Each laugh felt like a physical tap against my pride, a small insistent chip at my armor. Daniel squeezed my hand again, his touch a silent anchor, as if to steady me. "Everyone," he announced, his voice carefully controlled. "This is Emily." I stood there frozen, in the doorway of the Whitmore dining room, painfully aware of every detail that rendered me an anomaly. My boots still bore traces of the roadside dust. My Marine Corps jacket, now a badge of shame, had grease smudges smeared across one sleeve. My hands, though cleaner than they had been, still betrayed faint telltale stains that hadn't entirely vanished. And the room around me, it looked like something plucked from the pages of a high-end interior design magazine. A long, gleaming, polished wooden table stretched majestically down the center, adorned with sparkling crystal glasses and immaculately folded linen napkins. The lighting, warm and elegant, reflected off the gilded frames of antique paintings adorning the walls, casting a soft glow on a perfectly roasted chicken resting on a magnificent silver serving platter. Everyone else, every single guest, looked flawless. Pressed shirts, elegant dresses, hair styled with an effortless perfection that spoke of expensive salons. And then there was me. Margaret Whitmore, a tall woman with silver hair, impeccably styled into a neat chignon at the back of her head, stood beside her husband at the head of the table. Her eyes, cool and assessing, performed a slow, deliberate journey from my dusty boots to my flushed face. She tilted her head, a gesture of polite curiosity that felt anything but. "Well," she purred, her voice soft yet undeniably sharp, "you certainly made an entrance." A couple of people, emboldened by her leading remark, laughed again. Daniel cleared his throat, a sound of subtle discomfort. "Emily ran into a little trouble on the way here, Mom." Margaret raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Oh!" Her tone invited elaboration, yet implied skepticism. I stepped forward, forcing my voice to remain calm, even and steady despite the tremor in my chest. "There was a man broken down on Route 17. I explained, each word carefully measured. His truck overheated. I stopped to help him." For a moment, the room fell into an awkward silence. Then, from somewhere down the table, a quiet, almost theatrical voice drawled, "How noble." It was clearly not intended as a compliment. Margaret folded her hands politely, her expression a mask of detached interest. "That's very kind of you, Emily," she said, though her next words undercut any sincerity. "Though I imagine most people would have simply called roadside assistance." I didn't respond, unwilling to dignify the jab with a reply. Daniel, sensing my discomfort, swiftly pulled out the chair beside him. "Why don't you sit down, Emily?" he suggested gently, his eyes urging me to comply. I sat, sinking into the plush cushion, trying to disappear. As I did, Harold Whitmore finally spoke. He possessed the kind of voice that effortlessly commanded a room, filling the space without ever needing to be raised. It was a voice accustomed to authority, to being heard. "So," he began, his gaze piercing, studying me with an almost clinical detachment, "you're the Marine." "Yes, sir," I replied, my voice crisp, ingrained with military deference. He leaned back in his chair, a slight smirk playing on his lips. I'll admit, Daniel's choice surprised us. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside me. "Dad," but Harold raised a hand, a dismissive gesture that cut Daniel off mid-sentence. "I'm simply being honest, son," he stated, his eyes returning to me. "And honesty is something Marines value. Isn't it, Staff Sergeant?" "Yes, sir," I affirmed, my jaw tightening. "Well then," he continued, his tone calmly predatory, "I suppose we can start with the obvious question." The table had fallen into complete anticipatory silence, once more every eye fixed on me. "What exactly do you plan to do once this military phase of yours is over?" I blinked, momentarily stunned by the audacity of the question, the casual dismissal of my career. "Sir," he gestured vaguely toward my jacket, his hand waving away my entire professional identity. "This sort of life doesn't last forever, does it? Eventually people settle down, build families, and—" "We've always believed stability is important," Margaret added gently, her tone deceptively sweet, reinforcing her husband's point. One of the women across the table nodded sagely, chiming in, "Especially for young couples, dear." Daniel sighed quietly beside me, a barely audible exhalation of frustration. But I answered honestly, meeting Harold's gaze squarely. I've built my career in the Marine Corps, sir, I stated, my voice unwavering. I plan to continue serving for as long as I am able. Harold studied me like a man scrutinizing a dubious business proposal, his expression unreadable. Interesting, he murmured. He lifted his wine glass, taking a slow sip. I suppose Daniel finds that exciting. Another small ripple of polite yet derisive laughter moved around the table. Daniel's jaw tightened, his hand clenching under the table. That's not fair, Dad, he said, his voice strained. Margaret gave him a calming, condescending look. We're only trying to understand her background, Daniel. She turned back to me, her smile unwavering yet cold. Tell me, Emily, where did you grow up? Ohio, ma'am, I replied, my answer succinct, almost robotic. A small town. Yes, ma'am, I confirmed. And what did your parents do? My father worked in a factory. My mother was a nurse. Margaret's polite smile remained fixed, but I could clearly discern the judgment lurking beneath its surface, a silent assessment being made. Well, she drawled, a hint of disdain in her voice. Hard-working people, I'm sure. Harold took a deliberate bite of his roasted chicken before speaking again, savoring the moment. You must admit, Daniel, he said, directing his words to his son, though his gaze remained on me, comes from a rather different environment, wouldn't you say? Daniel leaned forward, ready to interject. Dad. But Harold continued, relentless. We raised him with certain expectations. His eyes, cold and critical, moved again to my grease-stained sleeve, a visible emblem of my perceived impropriety. I imagine dinner parties like this aren't exactly common in the Marine Corps, are they? Someone near the end of the table laughed out loud. This time, a sharp, unfiltered guffaw. I felt Daniel's hand tense beside mine, a surge of protective anger, but I kept my voice steady, my gaze unflinching. No, sir, I said, my voice cutting through the laughter. They're not. Margaret sighed lightly, a theatrical exhalation, as if attempting to smooth over the awkwardness she herself had orchestrated. Well, let's not dwell on such awkward beginnings. She gestured grandly toward the lavish spread of food. Please, everyone, let's eat. Plates began to move again, the clinking of silverware resuming its normal cadence. Conversation slowly restarted, a low hum of chatter, attempting to restore normalcy, but I could still feel the occasional probing glance drifting toward my jacket, my hands, my very presence at the table, like a judgment that lingered in the air. At one point, Margaret leaned toward the woman seated next to her, her silver head almost touching the others, and whispered something. The woman covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking with stifled laughter. I focused intently on my plate, willing myself to disappear. Across from me, Daniel looked utterly apologetic, his eyes pleading for understanding. I'm really sorry, Emily, he whispered, his voice laced with genuine remorse. It's okay, I murmured back, though the truth was a heavy, bitter taste in my mouth. I felt smaller in that room, more diminished and insignificant than I had in a very, very long time. It wasn't because of their immense wealth, nor the imposing grandeur of their house. It was because they had already rendered their verdict on who I was forming their rigid conclusions before I had even walked through their front door. And nothing I said, nothing I could say seemed capable of altering their preconceived notions. Dinner continued in this strained, subtly hostile fashion for another 20 minutes. There was polite conversation punctuated by subtle barbed comments, a few jokes that weren't really jokes at all, the kind that chipped away at your self-worth. Until suddenly, the distinct familiar sound of tires crunching on gravel drifted through the open dining room window once more. At first, no one paid it any mind, dismissing it as a passing car, but the engine noise grew steadily louder, closer. Someone outside closed a car door with a definitive thud, and a moment later, the front door of the house creaked open again. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed through the grand hallway. Then an older voice, gruff yet friendly, called out, "Hello? Anyone home?" Daniel frowned slightly, a puzzled expression on his face. Margaret looked utterly bewildered, her social composure momentarily shattered. Harold Whitmore, mid-sentence, about some local political matter, slowly turned his head, his gaze drawn toward the doorway. A second later, the elderly man I had helped on the side of the road, the very same Frank, stepped into the dining room. For a long, agonizing moment, no one spoke. The elderly man stood framed in the elegant doorway, his cap held respectfully in one hand. The warm dining room lights caught the deep, weather-beaten lines in his face, highlighting the worn denim jacket he wore over a faded plaid shirt, a stark contrast to the impeccable attire of the assembled guests. It took me only half a second, a flicker of recognition to place him. Frank, the same man whose truck I had fixed less than an hour earlier. My first thought was a surge of simple, bewildered confusion. What on earth was he doing here? Frank, seemingly unfazed by the sudden stunned silence, looked around the room with a mild curiosity, as if he had simply wandered into a gathering he hadn't quite expected, perhaps a little lost. Well now, he said, his voice warm and steady, carrying easily through the quiet space. Looks like supper time. Then his eyes landed on me, and a wide, genuine smile spread across his face, instantly dispelling his momentary confusion. Well, I'll be, he chuckled. Emily. Every head in the room, as if on cue, turned toward me again. I felt Daniel shift beside me, his grip tightening on my hand. You know him, he whispered, his voice laced with utter disbelief. Before I could even begin to answer, Frank took another step, continuing to walk into the room, his presence utterly transforming the atmosphere. And that was when everything truly changed. Harold Whitmore, the formidable patriarch, pushed his chair back with such force it scraped loudly, jarringly across the polished hardwood floor. Then he stood up. Not slowly, not casually. He rose with an abrupt, almost instinctual snap, the way soldiers stand to attention when someone of immense rank or profound importance enters the room. The rest of the table followed suit almost immediately. One by one, chairs were moved with a rustle of cloth and wood. People stood, their faces a mixture of confusion and sudden dawning respect. Margaret Whitmore rose too, though her expression had shifted from confident amusement to something much more uncertain, a fragile bewilderment. Daniel looked just as utterly confused, as I felt, perhaps even more so. Mr. Miller, Harold exclaimed, his voice completely different now. Devoid of its earlier disdain, filled instead with an almost reverent respect. Frank gave him a friendly, familiar nod. Evening, Harold. The casual, almost paternal way he used Harold's first name seemed to electrify everyone at the table, deepening their bewilderment. Harold stepped forward quickly, a man suddenly out of his element. I didn't realize you were stopping by tonight, sir. Frank shrugged a relaxed gesture. Wasn't planning to herald. He glanced back at me, a silent acknowledgement. But I had a reason. Margaret looked from Frank to me, and back again, her eyes darting between us. You two know each other? She asked, her voice laced with a desperate need for an explanation. Frank chuckled. Met about 40 minutes ago. Now the confusion around the table was absolute palpable. Harold frowned slightly, still trying to piece together the puzzle. On the road, Harold managed. Frank nodded. Truck overheated on Route 17. He gestured toward me, a quiet, powerful motion. This Marine right here pulled over and fixed it for me. Every single eye in the room returned to me, but the silence felt different now, heavier charged with a new, unforeseen significance. Frank stepped further into the room, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the assembled guests, including the stunned Whitmores. You've got a good one here, Harold, he said calmly, his voice ringing with quiet authority. Harold blinked, momentarily speechless. I'm sorry. Frank leaned his cap against the back of an empty chair, his movements unhurried, deliberate. This young woman, he continued, his voice steady and clear, stopped on a rural road when half a dozen other cars, I might add, drove right past. He looked around the table, his eyes piercing, meeting the gazes of the discomforted guests. She didn't ask who I was, didn't care what I drove, didn't care how old my truck was. She just helped. Because that's who she is. No one spoke. The silence was thick, pregnant with unspoken truths. Frank nodded toward my grease-stained sleeve, the very evidence of my supposed impropriety, now transformed into a badge of honor. That's why she looks like she crawled out from under an engine, Harold, because she was busy doing the right thing when nobody was watching. A few guests shifted uncomfortably in their expensive shoes, a wave of palpable embarrassment washing over them. Frank's tone wasn't angry, not accusatory, but it carried an undeniable weight, a gravitas that compelled attention. It was the kind of authority that came from someone who had spent a lifetime earning respect, a voice that had been listened to in far more critical situations. Harold cleared his throat, a nervous gesture. Well, that was certainly kind of her. Frank turned slowly toward him, his gaze unwavering, penetrating to the very core of Harold's being. You remember what we used to say in the Corps, Harold? Harold froze, his entire demeanor stiffening. It was a reaction I hadn't seen before, a sudden, almost involuntary rigidity. Frank continued, his voice soft yet incredibly potent. Character shows up when nobody's watching. Now I noticed something I hadn't perceived before, a subtle shift in Harold Whitmore's posture. He stood before Frank with a ramrod straightness and almost rigid deference, as if an old, deeply ingrained habit from a lifetime ago had resurfaced without him even consciously thinking about it. Daniel leaned toward me, his voice a bewildered whisper. "Wait," he breathed. Do you know who that is?" I shook my head slightly, just as lost as he was. Frank, with an almost defiant casualness, pulled out a chair and sat down at the table, making himself at home. Margaret, still looking utterly bewildered, recovered slightly. "Frank," she said, her voice careful, would you like to join us for dinner?" Frank smiled a genuine warm smile. "Well, I wasn't planning to interrupt anything," he said, his eyes twinkling as he glanced around the table. Though it looked like things were getting pretty interesting, Harold. A few of the guests quickly averted their eyes, suddenly finding the roasted chicken fascinating. Harold, still visibly shaken, slowly sat down again, his movements stiff. "Yes, well." Frank folded his hands calmly on the table, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces. "Emily here told me she was on her way to meet her boyfriend's parents." He began, his voice a casual revelation. His eyes moved around the room, landing on Margaret and Harold. "Funny thing is, she never mentioned they were you folks." Margaret blinked, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. Daniel finally found his voice a nervous stammer. "Mr. Miller, I'm Daniel." Frank smiled warmly, genuinely. "Good to meet you, son." Then he leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes fixed on Daniel, a profound statement in his gaze. "You picked a strong partner, Daniel." Daniel nodded slowly, a newfound pride dawning in his eyes. "I believe I did, sir." Frank looked back at Harold again, his voice dropping to a quiet, almost intimate tone. "Harold," he said. "Yes, sir," Harold replied automatically, a reflex from a distant past. A few guests exchanged surprised, wide-eyed looks. Frank tilted his head slightly, his gaze piercing through the years. "You remember a night in Quang Tri Province in 1968, Harold?" The room went completely, utterly still. Harold's face changed dramatically, a profound shift, as recognition hit him like a physical blow, a torrent of memories he hadn't allowed himself to visit in decades. "Yes," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. Frank nodded a solemn confirmation. "That was the night your patrol got pinned down, wasn't it?" Harold didn't speak, his eyes wide lost in the harrowing past. Frank continued calmly, relentlessly. "You were 22 years old, a young lieutenant trying to get your men home alive, trapped, outgunned, and facing what looked like certain death." He paused, letting the gravity of the moment hang in the air. "And the Marine who pulled you out of that ditch, the one who stayed with you, fought beside you, got you and your men out of there alive against all odds." Frank tapped the table lightly, a small, impactful gesture. "That was me." No one in the room moved. No one breathed. The air was thick with the weight of revelation. Frank looked around the table slowly, his gaze sweeping over the shocked faces before turning back to me, a profound look of respect in his eyes. "So when I say this young Marine has character, Harold," he concluded, gesturing toward me again, "I know what I'm talking about. She's one of us." I knew exactly what I was talking about. Harold Whitmore, whose earlier jests had echoed with a sneering condescension, now slowly lowered his gaze, his face a canvas of dawning shame. For the first time all evening, the man who had found me so amusing seemed utterly mortified. A profound silence descended upon the grand dining room the moment Frank finished speaking. It wasn't the polite, carefully constructed quietude that had masked earlier discomfort. This was something entirely different, almost physically palpable. It felt heavy, laden with unspoken thoughts, and deeply reflective. The kind of silence that settles over a space when a group of people collectively realizes the stark truth they might have been utterly demonstrably wrong. I sat there suddenly acutely aware of my own hands, unsure what to do with them, where to place them. Just 20 minutes earlier, these very same people had been barely stifling their laughter at the smudge of grease on my jacket, a visible mark of my unsuitability. Now it seemed no one dared to even glance at it. Frank, meanwhile, leaned back ever so slightly in his ornate dining chair, completely and utterly at ease. He exuded the relaxed confidence of a man who had simply walked into a familiar, beloved space, rather than a room full of stunned, formerly judgmental dinner guests. Margaret Whitmore, regaining a sliver of her composure, cleared her throat, a small, brittle sound in the quiet. Well, Frank, she said carefully, her voice still a little shaky, we didn't realize Emily had helped you. Frank offered a small, almost imperceptible shrug, a gesture that conveyed a world of meaning without uttering another word. She didn't know who I was then, nor did it matter, the shrug implied. He cast his eyes around the table again, a subtle, knowing glance that took in every frozen face. And that truly was what made it all matter. Under the polished surface of the dining table, Daniel's hand found mine slipping quietly, reassuringly over my knuckles. I could feel the surge of pride in the gentle yet firm way he squeezed my fingers, a silent acknowledgement of the moment's gravity and triumph. Across the table, Harold Whitmore remained visibly stunned, still reeling from the story Frank had just recounted. He stared down at his untouched plate for a long moment, as if seeking answers in the intricate pattern of the china, before slowly, reluctantly lifting his head again. Frank, he said, his voice unusually quiet, almost hushed. I didn't expect to see you tonight. Frank offered a faint, knowing smile. Life has a funny way of arranging meetings, Harold. He gestured toward me again, a gesture that now held a profound significance. If she hadn't stopped on that road, I'd still be sitting beside that old truck, probably waiting for a tow truck that never arrived. Margaret's previously rigid posture softened visibly, a slight slump of her shoulders, indicating a thawing of her initial iciness. Her carefully composed facade was cracking. Well, she managed, her voice still a little tight. We're certainly grateful she helped you. Frank tilted his head slightly toward her, his expression unreadable, yet his message crystal clear. You should be. There was no overt accusation in his tone, no heavy judgment, but the underlying meaning was unmistakable, echoing with the unspoken sentiment that their gratitude was the least they could offer. The guests around the table shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, a collective ripple of unease. The earlier dismissive laughter had vanished entirely, leaving no trace behind, replaced by a stifling awareness of their own misjudgment. One of the older men, seated near the far end of the table, leaned forward slowly, his eyes narrowed in recognition. Frank Miller, he said, drawing out the name, a dawning realization in his voice. You're the Frank Miller, aren't you? Frank gave him a mildly puzzled look, as if genuinely considering the question. I suppose that depends on which one you mean. The Veterans Foundation? The man clarified, his excitement growing. The one that built the rehabilitation center in town. The incredible facility that's done so much good for our returning service members. Frank nodded casually, as if discussing the weather. Oh, that was a group effort. Many good people involved. The man looked utterly impressed, a mixture of awe and disbelief on his face. I've read about you in the paper, he murmured almost to himself, countless times. Margaret, her eyes wide with surprise, turned slightly toward Harold, a silent, pointed question in her gaze. You never mentioned Frank was involved with the foundation. Harold let out a quiet sigh, a sound of resignation, and perhaps a touch of long-suffering patience. He's involved in a lot of things, Margaret, more than I could ever list. Frank waved the comment away, with a dismissive hand, a modest gesture. I stay busy. It keeps me out of trouble. Then he glanced back toward me again, his gaze holding mine. Mostly because people like Emily here remind me why it matters. Why any of it matters at all. That particular sentence, delivered with quiet conviction, landed differently than all the others spoken that evening. It wasn't just praise anymore. It was a profound lesson Frank was imparting to everyone in the room. Daniel, sensing the shift, leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on Frank. Mr. Miller, he began, his voice respectful but firm. Emily told you she was coming here tonight, right? Frank nodded. She mentioned meeting her boyfriend's family, said she was a little nervous. Daniel gave a small, confident smile, a hint of his earlier self-assurance returning. Well, I'm the boyfriend. Frank chuckled, a warm, genuine sound that softened the room's remaining stiffness. Then you've made a good choice, son. A very good choice indeed. Daniel looked genuinely proud, his chest expanding almost imperceptibly. I know. Margaret, attempting to regain some semblance of her former poise, reached for her wineglass. But I noticed her hand, usually so steady and confident, had lost its firm grip. A subtle tremble now ran through her fingers. Emily, she said gently, her voice surprisingly soft, we had no idea you'd stop to help someone. I answered honestly, simply. It didn't seem like something worth mentioning. Frank looked at me, a deep understanding in his eyes, and nodded slowly. That right there, he said softly, his voice full of quiet conviction. That right there is exactly why it matters. It's the very essence of it. Harold rubbed his chin thoughtfully, a gesture of deep contemplation. Then, with an air of profound regret, he looked across the table directly at me, his gaze no longer mocking but earnest. Emily, he began, the words seeming difficult for him, heavy with their newfound weight. I owe you an apology. Earlier that evening, he had been absolutely certain of his position, his judgment, and his assumptions. Now he looked like a man meticulously, painfully reconsidering every single one of those long-held certainties. I judged you too quickly, he continued, his voice steadying, though still tinged with humility. You walked in late, and I drew conclusions, prejudiced ones. I held his gaze, offering a small understanding nod. That happens sometimes, Mr. Whitmore, to all of us. Harold nodded slowly, absorbing my words. Frank, seeing the sincerity, leaned forward slightly, ready to further the lesson. You know, Harold, he said, his voice taking on a familiar storytelling cadence. I remember another young Marine people underestimated once. Harold raised an eyebrow, a flicker of curiosity replacing his earlier shame. Oh, and who might that be? Frank pointed a finger directly at him, a warm smile playing on his lips. You. A few guests around the table managed faint surprise smiles, the first true smiles of the evening. Frank continued, his voice rich with reminiscence. When I first met you in Vietnam, Harold, you were barely old enough to shave, fresh out of basic, eager as a puppy. Harold chuckled quietly, a genuine self-deprecating sound. That's not entirely inaccurate, Frank. I felt like a boy thrown into a man's war. Frank nodded, his eyes twinkling. Some of the older officers, the career men, didn't think you'd last a month. They thought you were too green, too naive for what we were facing. Harold looked genuinely surprised, his brow furrowed. I didn't know that. You never told me. Frank smiled, a knowing glint in his eyes. Most leaders never hear what people say about them before they prove themselves, Harold. They simply go about the business of becoming the person they're meant to be. He gestured toward me again, completing the circle of his lesson. Emily's already proven something important tonight, something fundamental. Margaret, her curiosity piqued, leaned forward. What's that, Frank? What has she proven? Frank answered calmly, his gaze sweeping over the faces at the table. That she'll do the right thing. Not because someone's watching, not for reward or recognition, but simply because it is the right thing to do. She'll do it even when nobody is looking. The table stayed quiet again, the weight of his words settling over them. Then Daniel spoke, his voice carrying a quiet, unwavering pride that resonated through the silence. That's exactly who she is, Mr. Miller. Every single day. Margaret looked at her son, a long, searching gaze, then back at me. I could almost physically see the gears turning, the shift happening in her mind. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, but it was undeniably real, a fundamental recalibration of her perceptions. Well, she said slowly, her voice softer than I'd heard it all evening. It seems tonight we may have misjudged our guest. Grossly misjudged, in fact. Frank offered a small, knowing smile. Seems that way, Margaret. Harold finally picked up his fork again, a small symbolic gesture of return to normalcy. Then he looked at me across the table, his expression earnest and humble. Emily, he said, his voice tinged with sincere regret, I'd like to start this evening over. He gestured toward the empty chair beside Daniel, which I had abandoned earlier in the evening when the atmosphere grew too stifling. If you're willing, that is. If you're... I nodded, a small, grateful smile touching my lips. I am. And for the very first time, since I had walked into that opulent, initially hostile house, the palpable tension in the room began to truly ease. A collective sigh, unspoken but felt, seemed to sweep through the space. But the biggest change wasn't just in the room itself. It was far more profound, reflected in the way Harold Whitmore now looked at me. Earlier that night, he had seen a Marine who didn't belong, an anomaly, a disruption to his carefully ordered world. Now, however, he was seeing something else entirely, something deeply familiar, something he recognized with a stirring in his own memory, character. Dinner resumed slowly after that, but it was a completely different affair. It wasn't in the stiff, uncomfortable way it had dragged on earlier in the evening, but with the careful, almost reverent pace of people who were actively, genuinely reconsidering their earlier judgments and perceptions. Margaret, her face now softened with a new warmth, asked the housekeeper to bring another place setting, this time for me, placing it beside Daniel. Frank, with a calm air of having orchestrated a quiet revolution, settled comfortably into a chair near the center of the table, now truly one of them. The roasted chicken was passed around again, its aroma mingling with the rich scent of bowls piled high with creamy mashed potatoes and vibrant green beans. The quiet, companionable clinking of silverware returned to the room a harmonious counterpoint to the gentle hum of conversation. But the tone had fundamentally changed. Earlier, the conversations had felt like a subtle, relentless evaluation, a series of veiled interrogations. Now they felt like genuine flowing conversation born of shared respect and burgeoning interest. Frank seemed perfectly comfortable sitting among the Whitmores and their esteemed guests, a seasoned storyteller in his element. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, occasionally sharing small, poignant, or humorous stories about the town, the challenges and successes of the Veterans Center, or the quiet, enduring life on the farm where he still lived. More than once, someone at the table asked him questions, clearly captivated by his presence and his understated wisdom. But every so often, with subtle grace, Frank would bring the conversation back around to me, ensuring I remained a central valued part of the dialogue. "So, Emily," he said at one point, turning his gaze toward me, his eyes full of warmth. "How long have you been in the Corps now?" "Almost 9 years," I replied, feeling a newfound ease in sharing. "Staff sergeant already," he said, with a nod clearly impressed. "That's no small thing, Emily. Not for anyone." Harold looked at me with an entirely new interest, his previous skepticism replaced by genuine curiosity. 9 years, he repeated as if tasting the words. "That means you enlisted young. Very young." "I was 18, I said, a slight smile touching my lips. "What made you choose the Marines?" He asked, a hint of genuine wonder in his voice. It was a fair question, and one I'd answered countless times over the years, often with a practiced, somewhat detached explanation. But tonight felt different. Tonight they were truly listening. "My father served in the Army," I explained, looking around at the attentive faces. "When I was younger, I watched how much pride he had in that time, how it shaped him into the man he was. When I graduated high school, I knew I wanted to challenge myself to find that same kind of purpose and discipline." Frank chuckled a soft, approving sound. "You picked the toughest branch to do that, didn't you?" "I did," I admitted, a quiet sense of satisfaction in my voice. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful, her earlier reserve completely gone. "And you've been deployed?" "Yes, ma'am." "To where?" "Mostly the Middle East," I answered concisely. Margaret nodded slowly, her brow furrowed in contemplation. "I can't imagine that life, Emily. It sounds unfathomable." I shrugged gently, acknowledging the truth in her words. "It's not easy sometimes, ma'am, not by a long shot. But it's meaningful, profoundly meaningful." Frank lifted his glass, slightly a silent toast. "That it is." The guests at the table listened with growing attention, their earlier amusement at my presence having transformed into something far deeper, genuine curiosity and a palpable dawning respect. One of the men across the table, a distinguished lawyer who had earlier scoffed, now asked earnestly about life on base. Another, a university professor, inquired about leadership in the military, its unique challenges and rewards. Someone else, a woman who had barely looked at me before, asked what it was truly like training young Marines, shaping the next generation of service members. I answered each question calmly, thoughtfully, offering glimpses into a world they clearly knew little about. But the conversation shifted again, taking on a more direct, purposeful tone. When Harold spoke, his voice measured. "Frank," he said, drawing everyone's attention. "You said earlier that Emily reminded you of something important." Frank nodded slowly. "I did, Harold." Harold rested his hands on the table, a gesture of quiet anticipation. "What exactly did you mean by that, Frank? I'd like to understand." Frank wiped his hands with his napkin, a deliberate, almost ritualistic gesture, and leaned back slightly in his chair. "When people get older, Harold," he began, his voice taking on a reflective, almost philosophical tone, "they start judging things by appearances." He looked around the table, his gaze settling on each guest for a moment. "Nice house," he murmured, his eyes sweeping over the opulent room. "Good clothes, the right schools, the kind of signals society teaches us to look for, the markers of success." Margaret looked slightly uncomfortable, a faint blush rising to her cheeks, as if Frank were articulating her very thoughts from earlier in the evening. Frank continued calmly, his voice gentle but unwavering. "But the older I get, the more I realize those things don't tell you much about a person. Not really." He nodded toward me, a profound warmth in his eyes. "I saw something today, Harold, that matters a lot more than any of those external markers." The table was quiet again, every eye fixed on Frank, awaiting his wisdom. Frank spoke slowly, carefully, choosing his words with precision, allowing each one to land with impact. Emily didn't know who I was when she stopped that car on the side of the road. She didn't know my background, didn't know my connections, didn't know that helping me, a stranger, might lead her into a room like this to a dinner with influential people. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. She helped because someone needed help. Pure and simple. No ulterior motive, no expectation of reward. Daniel nodded quietly, a silent affirmation of Emily's innate goodness. Frank continued, his voice gaining in quiet power. That kind of character doesn't come from money, Harold. It doesn't come from reputation or status or what school you attended. It comes from deep abiding values, from the heart. Harold listened carefully, his eyes fixed on Frank, absorbing every word. Frank turned slightly toward him, his gaze direct and meaningful. And you, Harold, you know something about those values, don't you? You embody them. Harold nodded slowly, a profound understanding passing between the two old Marines. Yes, Frank, I do. Frank smiled faintly, a gentle, nostalgic smile. I remember that night in Vietnam very clearly, every detail. The guest, sensing a deep personal moment, leaned in slightly captivated. You were a young lieutenant, Frank recounted, his voice painting a vivid picture. Barely out of officer candidate school, trying to get your men through a bad situation. A truly hellish one. Harold gave a quiet, self-deprecating laugh, a shadow of the past flickering in his eyes. I was scared out of my mind, Frank. Terrified, actually. Frank pointed a finger at him, not in accusation, but in solemn acknowledgement. But you stayed, Harold. You didn't break. You made sure every single man under your command got out alive, even when it meant risking your own skin countless times. He looked around the table again, a powerful message in his eyes. That's what leadership looks like. That's character in action. Harold sat quietly for a long moment, lost in the memories Frank had evoked. Then he looked back at me, his gaze now filled with profound respect and a deep sense of shared understanding. Emily, he said, his voice husky with emotion, I owe you more than just an apology. You walked into my home tonight after doing something truly honorable, something selfless, and instead of welcoming you with the respect you deserved, we judged you harshly. Margaret lowered her eyes slightly, a visible ripple of shame washing over her face. That was wrong, Emily, she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. So very wrong of us. I shook my head gently, offering a small, compassionate smile. It's understandable, Mrs. Whitmore. Truly. Harold raised an eyebrow, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. Why do you say that, Emily? Because people often assume the worst. I explained, my voice calm and even. Especially when they don't understand something or when it challenges their preconceived notions. It's easier to judge than to try and comprehend. Frank nodded approvingly, a deep satisfaction in his eyes. That's wisdom, Emily, pure and simple. Daniel squeezed my hand again, under the table, a silent message of pride and love. Harold leaned back in his chair, studying me thoughtfully, a new light in his eyes. You know, he said, a faint smile playing on his lips. When Daniel first told us about you, I pictured someone very, very different. My imagination went wild, I suppose. I smiled slightly, a knowing glint in my eye. I imagine you did, Mr. Whitmore. He chuckled softly, a genuine warm sound. Yes, I suppose I did. He looked around the table, his gaze sweeping over his family and guests, now all united in a newfound understanding. Well, he said, lifting his glass slightly, a small yet significant gesture, I think we've all learned something profound tonight, a much-needed lesson. Frank smiled, his eyes twinkling. That's the good part about getting older, Harold. You're still allowed to learn. You're still given the chance to grow. Margaret lifted her glass as well, a heartfelt warmth radiating from her. To learning, she said softly, her voice full of newfound sincerity. The rest of the table followed suit, glasses rising in a collective toast. And for the first time that entire evening, I felt completely, utterly at ease sitting there. Not because anyone had suddenly decided to approve of me, or because I had finally met their exacting standards. It was because something far more important had happened. They had seen me. Not the grease on my jacket, not just the Marine uniform, not the background they had judged so harshly earlier. They had seen the person underneath the core of who I was. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's all it takes to change everything. By the time dessert was served, the evening felt completely different from the one I had walked into hours earlier. Margaret, her earlier nervousness, replaced by a warm, maternal glow, brought out a homemade apple pie, still steaming gently from the oven, its comforting aroma filling the room. Rich vanilla ice cream slowly melting into a creamy pool accompanied each golden slice. The palpable tension that had filled the dining room earlier, thick and suffocating, had softened into something quieter, more genuine, like a forgotten melody returning with gentle warmth. People were talking again, but now the conversation sounded relaxed, unforced, instead of careful and calculating. Frank, with a twinkle in his eye, was telling a delightful story about a fishing trip he'd taken years ago with some Marines from the Veterans Center. A few of the guests laughed freely openly as he described one particularly boisterous Marine falling headfirst into the lake after confidently insisting he knew exactly how to steer a small temperamental boat. Daniel sat beside me, his arm resting lightly protectively on the back of my chair. Every once in a while, he would glance at me, a soft smile gracing his lips, as if he still couldn't quite believe how perfectly the evening had turned around, how triumphantly it had unfolded. Across the table, Harold Whitmore watched Frank finish his story, a thoughtful, almost solemn expression on his face. Then he cleared his throat, commanding the room's attention once more. "Frank," he said quietly, his voice tinged with a long-held emotion, "I never properly thanked you." Frank looked up, a slight furrow in his brow. "For what, Harold?" "For that night in Vietnam." The room grew still again, a hush falling over the table, as if the very air itself remembered the weight of those distant, harrowing memories. Frank waved a hand casually, almost dismissively. "Oh, Harold, that was a long time ago. Ancient history." Harold shook his head slowly, firmly. "Not to me, Frank. Not to me." He paused for a moment, choosing his words with immense care, as if each one carried a profound burden. "You saved my life." Frank studied him quietly, a flicker of that shared unspoken history passing between them. Then he gave a small, solemn nod, a deep understanding in his eyes. "Well, Harold, that's what Marines do. We look out for our own." Harold smiled faintly, a ghost of a youthful memory touching his lips. "And apparently," he added, glancing toward me, a new warmth in his gaze, "it's still what they do, thankfully." Margaret turned toward me. Then her expression far gentler, infinitely softer than the one she had worn earlier that evening, devoid of any judgment. "Emily," she said, her voice sincere, almost tender, "I want to apologize again, truly." She folded her hands together on the table, a vulnerable gesture. "When you walked through that door tonight, I saw someone who didn't fit the picture I had so carefully constructed in my mind. And instead of asking questions, instead of seeking to understand, I made assumptions, unkind ones." I nodded slightly, offering a quiet understanding. "It happens, Mrs. Whitmore. It's human nature." She gave a small, regretful smile. "Yes, but it shouldn't, and I know it won't happen again." Daniel leaned forward, a protective glint in his eye. "Mom, Emily, is pretty used to people underestimating her. It's been happening her whole life." Frank chuckled, a warm, knowing sound. "Most good Marines are son. It's part of what makes them strong." Margaret looked at me again, her eyes shining with newfound respect. "Well, Emily, I'm very glad you stopped to help Frank today." She paused, her smile widening. "And I'm very glad you came to dinner tonight. I truly am." Harold nodded in agreement, a sincerity in his gaze that hadn't been there hours before. "I'd like to say the same, Emily." He leaned back in his chair, studying me thoughtfully, a deep contemplative look on his face. "You know," he said, "when Daniel first told us about you, I worried. I worried quite a bit, actually." I raised an eyebrow, a hint of curiosity in my expression. "About what, Mr. Whitmore?" He smiled slightly, a touch of self-deprecating humor. "That you might not, fit into our world, Emily, into the life we envision for Daniel." Frank gave a soft, amused laugh, shaking his head gently. Harold glanced toward him, a wry smile on his face. But tonight, Harold continued, his voice resonating with deep conviction. "Tonight reminded me of something incredibly important." He tapped the table lightly with his fingers, emphasizing his point. "The world, Frank Miller, doesn't need more people who fit into the same mold. Not anymore." Frank lifted his fork, punctuating Harold's statement. "It needs people with character, Harold. That's what it needs." Harold nodded emphatically, his gaze turning back to me, filled with a profound understanding. "Exactly." He paused, then his smile softened. "And I can see now, Emily, precisely why my son cares about you so deeply." Daniel looked both relieved and amused, a warm flush rising to his cheeks. "Well, that's good to hear, Dad. Very good." Margaret smiled warmly, a genuine loving smile. "Yes, it is, Daniel. Very good indeed." Frank finished the last delicious bite of pie, wiped his hands with his napkin, and settled back, a thoughtful expression on his face. You know, he said, his voice a quiet rumination. Nights like this remind me of something my father used to say. Everyone looked toward him intrigued, awaiting his words. He used to say that a person's true character, their real worth, shows up in the quiet moments, not the grand gestures or the public declarations, but the small, unnoticed acts. He pointed toward the large dining room window where the gravel driveway stretched into the cool, silent darkness. Like stopping on a lonely country road to help a stranger for no other reason than they needed it. He looked at me, his eyes full of warmth and meaning. That's the kind of thing people truly remember, Emily. That's what truly echoes through time. I felt a quiet warmth spread through my chest, hearing that a deep, resonant comfort. Not pride exactly, but just the profound, settled feeling that maybe, just maybe, I had done something small that truly mattered, that truly made a difference. Daniel squeezed my hand again, his eyes meeting mine. I already knew that about her, Mr. Miller. He said, his voice soft but unwavering. Harold smiled a peaceful, contented smile. Well, Daniel, I'm certainly glad we know it now, too. The evening slowly began to wind down, after that the warmth and camaraderie lingering in the air. Coats were gathered from the foyer. Guests thanked Margaret profusely for a truly unforgettable dinner, a sentiment now spoken with genuine gratitude. Cars, their engines, purring softly, pulled away from the long gravel driveway, one by one their taillights disappearing into the Virginia night. Frank stood near the front door, ready for his own departure, a quiet dignity about him. Before stepping outside, he turned toward me, a meaningful glint in his eye. Emily has had, Emily, he said. Yes, sir. You ever get out toward the Veterans Center in Warrington? It's a busy place. Not often, I admitted. My schedule keeps me pretty tied up at the base. You should, Frank urged, a subtle invitation in his voice. He nodded toward Harold, who was now standing nearby, a faint, proud smile on his face. This old lieutenant here helps run a few programs for younger veterans. Important work. He's been invaluable. Harold chuckled, a genuine warm sound. Trying to give back a little Frank, that's all. Frank smiled a deep, knowing smile. People like Emily, Harold, are exactly the kind of leaders those programs need. Natural leaders. Harold looked thoughtful, considering Frank's words, and then turned to me, his expression earnest. Well, Emily, he said, extending his hand, a gesture of newfound respect. I'd be honored if you ever wanted to stop by. We're always looking for good people to share their experience. I'd like that very much, Mr. Whitmore, I replied, shaking his hand, feeling the genuine warmth of his grip. Frank tipped his cap slightly, a final familiar gesture. Good. Then he stepped outside into the cool, crisp Virginia night, the scent of pine and damp earth rising to meet him. Daniel and I stood on the wide porch watching as Frank's old dependable truck rumbled slowly down the gravel driveway, its headlights cutting a path through the darkness. For a moment, we just listened to the quiet symphony of the countryside, the crickets chirping the distant rustle of leaves. Then Daniel looked at me, a playful smirk on his face. You know, he said, his voice soft with amusement, that might just be the most dramatic dinner my family has ever had, or ever will. I laughed softly, a lightness in my chest I hadn't felt in hours. I'm glad it ended the way it did, Daniel. Truly. He nodded his arm, wrapping gently around my waist as we turned to walk back inside. Me too, Emily. Me too. As we walked back into the now quiet, transformed house, I found myself thinking about how the whole evening had unfolded. It would have been so easy to hold on to resentment, to stew in anger about the laughter, the assumptions, the outright rudeness. But life, I realized, often has a funny way of teaching people lessons when they least expect it, when their defenses are down. Sometimes the best kind of revenge isn't about proving someone wrong with anger or biting sarcasm. Sometimes it's simply about quietly, authentically showing them who you truly are, letting your actions speak far louder and more eloquently than their expectations ever could. It's about letting your true character shine. If this story reminded you of someone who showed unexpected kindness when it mattered most, even when no one was watching, I hope you'll share it with them. And if you believe, as I do, that character still matters deeply in this complicated world, I'd be honored if you followed along for more stories like this one. Because sometimes the smallest moments, like stopping on a quiet country road to help a stranger, can truly change everything.